Now let's talk about cross-zone balancing. So let's take an example of a very imbalanced situation, but it will illustrate the point. So we have two availability zones, and the first one has a load balancer with two EC2 instances, and the second one also has a load balancer, so a load balancer instance, obviously, with 8 EC2 instances. The load balancer's instances are part of the same, more general load balancer. So the client is accessing these load balancers, and so with cross-zone load balancing, each load balancer instance will distribute evenly across all registered instances in all availability zones. So the client itself is sending 50% of the traffic to the first ALB instance and 50% of the traffic to the other ALB instance. But each ALB is going to redirect that traffic across all 10 EC2 instances, regardless of which availability zones they're in. This is why it's called cross-zone load balancing. So if you take a look at the second ALB, instance, it's going to send 10% of the traffic it receives, okay, to all these instances. Because we have 10 instances, so each of them gets 10% of the traffic. And same story with this first ALB instance, it's going to send also 10% of traffic to all these instances. So in this example, with cross-zone balancing, we are distributing the traffic evenly across all EC2 instances. And that may be something you want to have or not, who knows. But at least this behavior is available to you. The second behavior that's available to you is to not have cross-zone balancing. So we take the same example, but without cross-zone balancing, the requests are distributed in the instances of the node of the elastic load balancer. So in this example, what we have is that the client sends 50% of the traffic to the first AZ and then 50% of traffic to the second AZ, okay? But the first ALB instance is going to send the traffic to only the EC2 instances in its region. So that means that each EC2 instance in this availability zone is going to get 25% of the traffic overall, okay? So half and half. And the one on the right-hand side will again divide up the traffic it receives into the EC2 instances that are registered within its AZ, so AZ2. So we can see here, without cross-load balancing, the traffic is contained within each AZ, but if there are an imbalanced number of EC2 instances in each AZ, then some EC2 instances of a specific AZ will receive more traffic than others. It's just an option to know about. There's no right or wrong answer. It depends on the use case, obviously. So for the ALB, cross-zone load balancing is always on and you cannot disable it. And usually when data goes between one AZ to another in AWS, you have to pay for it. But because it's always on and you can disable it, you don't pay for inter-AZ data transfers. For the network load balancer now, it is disabled by default, but you pay an amount of dollar if you wanted to enable cross-zone load balancing, and in which case you will have to pay for the data transfers between the availability zones. And finally, the classic load balancer, which has cross-zone load balancing disabled by default, and if you enable it, there's going to be no charges for inter-AZ data transfers. So all load balancers have this capability. The ALB is always on by default. The NLB, you need to enable it and you're going to pay for it, and the CLB, you can enable it and you're not going to pay for it, okay? So just for the sake of this hands-on, I've created a CLB and NLB, but you don't have to do it. I'm just going to show you the settings. So for the classic load balancer right here, if I scroll down, all the way down, we have cross-zone load balancing that is disabled by default, but I can change that setting and click on enable it, and this will evenly distribute the traffic across all my EC2 instances that are registered for this classic load balancer. So here we go, and I'm not going to pay for it. For the ALB, it's always enabled by default, so there's no setting to change the cross-zone load balancing because it's always on by default for the application load balancer. And for the NLB, I scroll down and I see that cross-zone load balancing is disabled by default. And I will say, okay, I want to enable it. But here it says, by the way, you will pay regional data transfer charges because cross-zone load balancing is enabled. And for the NLB, this is something they will charge you for, okay? You will click on save and cross-zone load balancing will be enabled, but you will have to pay for it. That's it, all I wanted to show you. So you can just not have to do this hands-on, and I will see you in the next lecture.